Taking the time to listen to today's episode. As you know, the current crisis in Myanmar is extremely concerning, and we appreciate that you're taking the time to stay informed. There is even value just in becoming more aware and helping to inform others. So please consider sharing this episode so that more people may learn about what is really happening in the country. It's critical to ensure that this issue remain present in the public discourse. For now, let's get on to the interview itself.
Myanmarပြည်ညီဖို့ပဲလွန်စအဖြစ်လက်ထဲစုပ်ကင်ထားတဲ့ကြောက်တုံးရဲ့ကြောဖို့ယူလာတဲ့ရေနဲ့ရိုးပုံပဲရှိတော့တယ်။ဘာဆက်လုပ်မှလဲမေးတော့ဘာမှလုပ်เสียမရှိဘူးလို့ဖြေခဲ့တယ်။တစ်ချိန်ကတောင်နှန်းတွေပေါ်တက်ရောက်เสียမလို့တော့တစ်ချိန်ကမြစ်ကြီးမြင့်ငယ်များစီလှော်ခတ်เสียမလို့တော့ကျန်းစာရဒီနေရာမှာဓာသွေးကြောက်တစ်ခုရှိတယ်မြေတွင်ဓာတ်တွေရှိတယ်ဘာဆက်လုပ်မှလဲဆိုတော့ဘာမှလုပ်เสียမရှိလို့ပြန်ဖြေလိုက်တယ်တဲလွန်စဖြစ်ဒီကြပြာကိုထားခဲ့ပါတယ်တိုင်းပြည်ရဲ့အခြေအဝင်းကိုခန့်မှန်းတွက်ချက်နိုင်အောင်ပေါ့ Map of Myanmar by Min Nying A. All that remain are a bubble in my fist, a water bottle in my backpack, and a heap of bones. What's next? They asked. No next, I answered. No need to climb the mountains of the past. No need to row towards the rivers and rivulets of the past. The sacred text says, There is a whetstone here. There is natural gas there. What's next? They asked. No next, I answered. For a clue, I will leave this poem so you can work out the depth and the breadth of the country.
I'm talking to Brian Haman. He's the co-author of the recent poetry anthology that appeared, Picking Off New Shoots Will Not Stop the Spring. It's an amazing collection that catalogs not only the recent and ongoing revolution, but also previous periods of conflict and revolution, 2007 and 1988. And there's a lot to discuss about this really remarkable work. So, Brian, thanks so much for joining us here at Inside Myanmar Podcast.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to join you.
So you co-collaborated on this project with thett. Can you share a bit about how you met him and where the idea came from to work on this?
Sure. So among the many things that I do, I'm a co-editor of the Shanghai Literary Review, and I edit the interview and the book review sections. And in 2019, I reached out to Coco in order to see if he would review a book that had been published by the British Council. The book was about Myanmar, and it was quite an extraordinary book. It was a unique 5-year project that was carried out by the British Council, and the title of the book is Hidden Words, Contemporary Short Stories from Myanmar. And it was edited by Lucas Stewart and Alfred Birnbaum. And the book itself was first published in 2015. The English translation was 2017. And it was essentially a collection of works that took place over a 4-year period. It was a nationwide program that carried out by the British Council that used literature as a platform to support freedom of expression, creativity, and social change within Myanmar's ethnic nationality states. And so I thought, given Coco's background, both in poetry and obviously he's from Myanmar, he would be an ideal person to review the book. And he kindly agreed to do that. And so that was how Coco and I first met each other. And then following the unfortunate events in February 2021 and the coup in Myanmar, Coco and I got back in touch with each other, and we were trying to figure out what we could do in order to support the people on the ground. Because at the time, there seemed to be this tremendous outpouring of not only poetry and prose, but also art as well. And a lot of international media were picking up on this. So you had stories in the New York Times and The Guardian and elsewhere, sort of cataloging or profiling the tremendous cultural outpourings of the people there as they were reacting to these terrible events. And so we came up with this idea to anthologize the works that were being written and disseminated largely online. And one of the underlying ideas behind the anthology was to preserve so much of what had been written, because as it was being disseminated online, the thinking was that it might actually disappear into this kind of ephemeral digital abyss. So we started to think about possible publishers who might be interested in producing a book And then we started to contact various publishers and so on. And Ethos was one of the first Ethos books in Singapore. Was one of the first publishers that we contacted, and they really took to the project from the very beginning. And they were very interested in it, and they wanted to support it. And it was also important to both Coco and myself that we had a regional publisher as well, who I suppose geographically, as well as to a certain extent politically and culturally and socially, had a kind of proximity to what was going on, and a sort of stake in what was happening in the country at that time. And so that's largely the genesis of the project.
Right. So then now you have a contract to do this book. You have enormous materials that are out there in the ether in all kinds of form. Just an explosion of creativity, as you mentioned. And now you have this immense task of somehow having to collect and review and collate and ultimately select pieces that you want to represent in this anthology, and grouping together thematically to be able to present the feeling and preserve the sediments of this time. So how did you go about that monumental task of having to choose what met the grade and what didn't, and what were you looking for? What kind of balance were you trying to achieve in that?
It was a very, it was an interesting process. It was a fluid process. Early on, for example, there were these tremendous outpourings online, and so there was a lot of material from which to choose. And so, there were various criteria. For example, there's the obvious aesthetic criteria. It wasn't just reproducing or anthologizing or cataloging or preserving all of the writings that had to have a kind of aesthetic quality to it. And Coco, being a poet, was obviously well positioned to make those kinds of aesthetic decisions or judgments. But early on, so much of the writing was quite optimistic, which was very interesting, because you had a spirit of optimism. You had a spirit of how can I put this? There was a sense that this is something that could be combated through nonviolent resistance, through mass protests, through people coming together from all walks of life and all segments of society. And so this spirit of optimism was very much present in so much of the writing that was emerging at the time. And as the military began its violent crackdown, which happened extremely quickly, there's a certain tonal shift in the writing, and we really wanted to capture that as well. So there was obviously an interest in the kind of aesthetic criteria. There was also an interest in preserving these kinds of shifts that were reacting in many ways to the events on the ground. There were also, practical difficulties as well in trying to really get in touch with people who are not only writers. One of the things that was particularly striking was that so many of the people who contributed or who were themselves writing were not writers. They came really from all walks of life. So there was a problem of access too, because of censorship, because of the need to preserve a certain degree of anonymity, just for the safety and the welfare of the contributors. So there were a number of things that we had to sort of consider as we were gathering these writings. There was also the issue of translation too. Coco was doing most, if not all, of the translation work for the first third of the book, and then obviously the book incorporated poetry from other aspects of Myanmar's history from 2020 to 2010, and then reaching back from 2010 to 1988. So, I mean, there were these various moving parts involved.
Right. So that was another decision you made, not only to characterize the moment, but to go back during the transition period to the Saffron Revolution, then to 1988. What led to that decision to want to not just look at this current moment of creative expression, but to want to capture it in previous cycles as well?
It seemed to both of us. It seemed to many people actually that Myanmar was regressing. That the longer this was happening, longer this kind of violence and this kind of these sorts of atrocities really were happening, the more Myanmar seemed to regress back in time. And so we were drawing on that history in order to illustrate that point, that actually this was a tremendous regression within Myanmar that is likely to set the country back decades, if not a generation or so. And so that's why we were drawing on that previous history. And also there were resonances between the poetry and the prose that was being written in 2021 and the poetry and prose that had been written, that had preceded it. And so there were these thematic connections as well.
Like what? Can you give an example of what kind of thematic connection you found between poetry from different eras?
Well, in terms of resistance, in terms of the violence, in terms of the kind of indomitable human spirit, in terms of the belief that poetry could be not only an expression of these universal human values and fears, but that poetry could be, and prose, I should add, could be a path to resistance as well, and that it could be something that could incite, that it could be something that could resist, that it could be something that it could be in many ways weaponized as well.
So these are some of the similarities thematically. Did you identify any divergences? Did you identify any places where you saw the artist today doing something above and beyond what was seen in previous eras?
I think for me, coming at it from largely from an outsider's perspective, because I hadn't really been involved with writing from Myanmar and generally culture from Myanmar. I think it was quite extraordinary the extent to which the poetry reflected the violence. I was quite struck by the extreme forms of violence that were being inflicted upon the people of Myanmar by the junta. And some of that is borne out in the poetry that we cataloged, but also in some of the stories, but in the images as well. I mean, the book opens, for example, with an image, a black and white image of a bamboo wall with a small bullet hole in it. And it was quite a moving tale. I remember when Coco received the poem in the image, and it was in reference to, I think, a young child who was sitting inside their home, and a stray bullet went through the wall, and the child was struck by the bullet. And so it was, that sort of random violence, and that that drove home the brutality of the events on the ground, and the sorts of things that so many people in Myanmar were facing. And I didn't necessarily get that sense in the poetry from the preceding years.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And I think that it also touches upon my reaction and my feeling when I was reading it. When I went into the book, I was, I just from my background, since the coup has happened, I've done, I don't know how many hours of interviews I've logged personally, talking to guests of all different backgrounds and hearing so many stories and getting those stories out. And then beyond the own interviews I've done, where I've listened to things firsthand, just the daily news that I've read, and just how much information and stories I've had since this happened, often in real time, often in some cases actually somewhat involved in a remote way, trying to help in a real time developing crisis. And so when I got the book and I started reading, I was expecting to come across a number of familiar themes, and I thought I've been hearing so many of these stories before, and they've been impacting me emotionally for so long that there's going to be some kind of similar resonance here, and kind of thinking more that this is a book, this is going to be a good book for people who might not know about the conflict or might not have the proximity that I have to hear stories probably for the first time that are going to be very impactful. But for me, there's probably going to be some kind of recycling of of familiar themes and motifs I've heard and I've been involved with. And one of the things that really amazed me and impressed me, moved me about the book was just, on one hand, of course, it was familiar because I've been living through this every day, although remotely, but very intimately involved with the daily events and stories. So of course there was a familiarity, but it moved me and impacted me beyond anything that I was expecting, just from the proximity that I already had. And it was just story after story was so powerful and so impactful. You know, there were times at the end of a chapter I would just have to put the book down and just hold what I had read. And I was really just amazed that as someone like me who had been so involved for so long with this, that these stories on top of all that were still having the kind of impact they were. And as I reflected about why is this getting through when I've heard so many, when I've been in the middle of so many, why are these collections now going even beyond the year plus of my interactions with this? It was the feeling, as you talk about. It was this intimate feeling of trying to describe how it actually feels. And this is an interesting thing to just spend a moment with examining, because it goes back to, I remember in the first few months of the protests, I was talking to a friend living in Yangon, and the thing he kept saying that really resonated with me and kind of set me on a mission, and hearing him describe it, is he said, you know, I read all the reports, I read all the articles, I see the news clips, I see the posts, and nothing I see actually describes how it feels. Like there's just this feeling that I don't know how to express. I don't know how to impart. And this individual ended up writing a series of journals over the course of several months, and he did an extraordinary job of describing this feeling and this just very mundane reality of how it felt. And since him saying that, because to be clear, I've lived in Myanmar many years, but I have not been there since February 2021. So many of my interviews are really driven by this one statement he told me, that this feeling is not getting out. And so in some of the more impactful interviews, or even parts of interviews I've had, it's been when the guest is describing the human loss, the human sense of loss and of hopelessness and of struggle and of trying to overcome that as well, all these things together. But when it just comes in these human terms of trying to overcome, that it really moves you. And I think that that was the quality that was found in these pages, and that's why I really want to encourage all listeners, even those who think they've, as me, have been following this very closely, and probably many have. There's still something in here that rises above the large events and the stories and the basic news, and just goes to the level of humanity of what it actually feels like to be in those moments. And it's just expressed so powerfully and really with the correct devastation of how it actually feels. And I think that's something, for whatever reason, that's something that is just not coming out to the extent that it should be. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that, bringing that humanity out, what you've seen in how the stories from Myanmar have been coming out, and how you were able to find these works and bring these works that managed to break through that plane to some extent and really just deliver this message in real human terms.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the reasons why Coco and I agreed to describe it in terms of witness poems and essays, rather than poetry as resistance or protest. And obviously, when I say poetry, I also mean essays as well, because the book has both. The point was really to offer a platform, to a certain extent unmediated, so not filtered through the media and so on. Obviously, there is a kind of filtering mechanism at work, because Coco and I were both editors, and so we were selecting which works to choose. But we had a tremendous number of works that from which to choose, and I would say the vast majority of them made it into the anthology. I should mention, actually, that at the very beginning, Matida was instrumental in connecting both Coco and myself with a lot of the writers and contributors on the ground in Myanmar, and she herself contributed as well. And really, the focus was, as I mentioned, allowing the people and their voices to emerge and to speak for themselves, and to really be this sort of the eyes and the ears and the mouths for what's going on, not to have it filtered through, for example, as I mentioned, the New York Times or the Guardian or whatever other media was reporting on it, but rather to allow the people there to bear witness to all of these horrific things that they were experiencing and seeing on a daily basis. And as I mentioned early on, the mood was very much an optimistic one, and so the pieces themselves weren't really sort of rife with that kind of violence. There was a sense of optimism. Pieces described people coming together nonviolently, gathering in the streets, peaceful protests, and so on. And I think we have one piece that describes, how people would bring food to each other, and others would bring water, and others would then clean up, and so on. And so there was a spirit of collaboration and sort of mutual solidarity, and so on. But that was quickly shattered as so many people began to suffer from the similar fate. I mean, you had large numbers of people curiously being shot in the head. I think one of the earliest people to become a victim of this kind of violence was a teenage girl who was at a peaceful protest, and she was wearing a moped or a motorcycle or motorbike helmet, and a bullet pierced it, and she was shot in the head. She died. And so, you have this, as I mentioned, you have this transition that was very much sort of reacting to or cataloging or, describing the escalation in violence by the junta. So, yeah, as I mentioned, it's very much about allowing the people on the ground to bear witness to these kinds of traumas themselves.
Right. So this was some process in collecting the different works and looking at which pieces to include. And of course, as you were doing this, things were changing in Myanmar, going from nonviolent protests to the crackdown, and the mood and the poetry and the stories you were collecting also indicated this shift as it was going on. So this was looking from the perspective of the organizers, of you and thett. This was from the inception of the idea to do this to the process of actually doing it, and as things were changing on the ground and shifting, this took some time and changes, I'm sure, as this process was going on. So I'm wondering if as you were doing this, was perhaps surprising to you, what was unexpected as you started to do the project, and with any expectations or thoughts you had about how it would go, and then as it started to turn out and you started to bring the pieces together and look at what you had, was there what manifested that might have been different or unexpected from what your thoughts were going into it?
I think, again, I was struck by the extreme levels of violence. I just that to me was it was quite moving. It was quite difficult to deal with. It's quite difficult to read those pieces that were coming in daily, monthly, and so on. That was, from an editorial perspective, that was quite challenging emotionally and psychologically as well to read. About these the traumas that so many were experiencing, family traumas, friends being jailed, being tortured, being killed, and so on. And as I said before, I have a certain distance from it. I can imagine it must have been unspeakably difficult for someone like Koko, who had friends, poets, Keza Win, Keti, and so on, who were murdered and who are no longer with us, sadly. And so that, I don't know if I had any particular expectations going into the book, but that was, again, one of the things that particularly struck me. The kind of barbarism involved with in terms of the military's reaction to what had started out as largely, if not entirely, peaceful, nonviolent protests.
Right, and you mentioned these poets' names that were killed since the coup developed. There have been many poets that have been killed or arrested, tortured. The regime has certainly gone after people of high profile, of artists of different stripes, and of poets particularly. Why do you think it is that this military regime sees poetry and poets as such a special threat that needs to be stamped out?
That's a good question. We all know about the power of the written word. We all know how it can mobilize people for good or ill. So I was listening to a talk that Coco had participated in with one of our translators, Kenneth Wong, and others, and they were talking about the military's response to this in terms of the type of poetry that it is producing and disseminating. And so poetry writing obviously can move people. It can move people to, in this case, resist what's happening, to protest, to catalog, to document, but it can also do the opposite as well. So writing, as we know, is a tremendously powerful medium. And that's one of the reasons why so much of the writing that was being done online obviously had to be done anonymously, because it presented a certain threat to the respective writers. And it's also why it's obviously being censored too. I think it really speaks to the power of the written word and the extent to which, even in our digital age, that these can mobilize, these poems and these short prose pieces can mobilize people, and the extent to which this presents a threat. It presents a threat to the military, to the government, that has on its side overwhelming force, and yet something like a line of poetry can threaten that force.
Yeah. I want to ask you as well. A number of the guests we have on we speak on Myanmar exclusively there, and so when we're talking about some of these events as they're unfolding, we're really just looking with a narrower focus, just of how the story has been developing in Myanmar. And yet, from your position, you've been an editor in looking at poetry in a number of different places. You have a wider context to look at. And so zooming out a bit and looking at Myanmar as a juxtaposition or comparison to other societies, the power of poetry or the role of poetry in other conflicts or in other societies that are less than free. What stands out in terms of how you've seen the expression in Myanmar, and what stands out is, and what diverges, as well as what kind of similar themes and in the human expression, the human desire to want to express oneself freely, do you see as consistent with other projects that you've done in other countries?
The obvious case is Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine vis-a-vis the Russian invasion and occupation. But obviously there are regional, I don't know if comparisons, but there are regional movements, resistance movements, and so on. So again, the obvious ones that come to mind are Hong Kong, Thailand, and Taiwan earlier. And we see these reactions to political violence, to dictatorial, authoritarian regimes on the part of artists and writers and so on. We see the power of culture to speak out, to clarify what's happening, and to act in some ways as a sort of a form of resistance. And this is something that is not only, this is an age-old story. I mean, we can go back to the ancient Greeks and so on. There is this history of war poetry and writing in general, and cultural reactions to war and violence throughout history. It doesn't matter whether it's in Europe or Southeast Asia or whatever the case may be. So this seems to be something archetypal in terms of human beings and how they react to in this case state-sponsored violence and terrorism, to military occupation and so on. And it's happening in Ukraine. It's happening in Myanmar. It continues to happen in Myanmar. Sadly, 2022. This started obviously in 2021. It's. I'm not entirely sure that I can really speak to that. It's an extraordinarily long and broad subject.
Sure.
but there does seem to be something within the human spirit that finds an outlet in poetry and in art, and also something that, that there's some impetus there to put these experiences in words or in images, and to use those words and images as an outlet or as a form of resistance or as something calling attention to what's happening.
Concerning this specific anthology that you've released, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am curious if there were certain particular pieces that stood out and that really stayed with you for some time and resonated, and you kept coming back to. Were there any particular pieces in here that really spoke to you specifically?
Yeah, I mean, there was one that I do come back to, and it's rather appropriately, I suppose, given the time in which we are recording this podcast. It's entitled "Spring" by Na Ba, and it's quite an extraordinary poem. And I don't know if I could read it now. It's not a very long poem.
It'd be wonderful.
It's quite extraordinary. So it's entitled "Spring." Spring seized, turned into swallows. Swallows caged, turned into clamors. Clamors silenced, turned into scenery. Scenery covered up, turned into eyes. Eyes forced shut, turned into dreams. Dreams denied, turned into maps. Maps destroyed, turned into memories. Memories deleted, turned into roads. Roads blockaded, turned into ancillary legs. Legs smashed, turned into wings. Wings clipped, turned into breeze. Breeze detained, turned into storm. Storm imprisoned, spawned a million offspring. Those offspring are our in-breath and out-breath, swallows in and out of our nostrils. Our spring. I think that's just such a tremendously powerful poem. The language is obviously very simple. The imagery is very down to earth. It's of the earth. It doesn't use this sort of metaphorical language, and yet it conveys so much breadth and so much meaning in these very clipped lines. It's just an extraordinary poem.
Yeah, right. And of course, the thing that stands out to me just hearing it the second time here is the mention of the in-breath and out-breath, which is the most basic meditative instructions that one can follow in a monastery or meditation center, just observing the in-breath and out-breath. And so bringing a sense of mindfulness to and cultural reference to this overall scene that's being painted, that's quite powerful.
Yeah, it really is. It really is, and I often ask myself how people can really have the presence of mind really to sit down and write amidst such extraordinarily difficult circumstances. To be able to reflect on that, to be able to reflect on the kinds of traumas that they're experiencing, ongoing traumas. These are traumas that are still quite fresh, and to have that presence of mind and to be able to sit down and to write that out, to be able to articulate that is also quite extraordinary. Yeah, for sure. What kind of reception has the book received? What kind of feedback have you heard? It's been largely well reviewed, I think. It's a very difficult anthology, and I suppose in many ways it's because of that difficulty. It's difficult to write about it because it is an anthology that deals with violence and death and murder and torture and all of these sort of horrific experiences. But as a collection, it has gotten I hesitate using the word, but it's gotten positive reviews.
Right. Yeah. Are there any other projects that you and thett have discussed doing as this conflict has stretched on?
Coco has a number of projects, and I suppose I'll let him describe those because he obviously knows far more about those respective projects. There There is a project that I'm trying to get off the ground here in Vienna, which is to have an exhibition of art from Myanmar, resistance or otherwise, at a local gallery here, in order to try and continue to draw attention to the fact that the situation in Myanmar is still unresolved. It's ongoing, and people are still suffering. People are sadly still dying, and so this is both this would be both an effort to draw attention to the situation, but also to try and support the people on the ground, the artists, and local organizations and so on that are continuing to be advocates for democracy and so on, human rights and so on.
That sounds great. I hope that does get off the ground, and I think finding a way to bring to amplify the voices of those that are resisting and to bring out their creative spirit. I think that is a message that's a way for many people who might not know so much about Myanmar as a country or culture or part of the world or geography. It's a way for them to enter into something universal and something that can touch us all, no matter where we live, what culture we're in, even what time we're in. It binds us together even centuries apart. So it's a very powerful thing.
Yeah, I mean, we touched briefly on Ukraine, and obviously the situation in Ukraine has really mobilized people throughout the world. And one of the things that I suppose I was a bit, perhaps disappointed by was the fact that what was happening in Myanmar didn't seem to register internationally, the way that it has in Ukraine. And I don't mean to single out Myanmar. Obviously, there are ongoing wars throughout the rest of the world. I think on most of the continents of the world, a war of one kind or another, and one of the hopes with this project, with subsequent projects like the gallery show that I mentioned, would be really to highlight that this is still something that's ongoing, and that these are universal reactions to this kind of violence. That we have this idea of kind of imagined communities based on various criteria, but that we are all part of this kind of human community, I suppose, and that suffering in places like Myanmar and elsewhere is no less worthy of our attention than the sufferings of people elsewhere, and really to kind of keep the spotlight on Myanmar, because the situation, as I mentioned, sadly, is still an ongoing one. And it seems to be an intractable situation too. I mean, it doesn't seem like there is an end in sight, sadly, because it seems to be the case that both sides are very much entrenched now, and a kind of back and forth.
And I think that your work does a brilliant job at doing that, of breaking through those headlines, breaking through those intermediaries, as you mentioned, was actually a conscious intention on your part, and bringing those voices. And I know for me, I'm in the US now, and when I meet people outside casually and the conversation comes up that I'm connected to Myanmar people that don't know me previously, I'm amazed that even among people who I would, just from talking to them for a few minutes, give the appearance of being somewhat well-informed, progressive, concerned about world issues, a consistent thing I've heard is, is that conflict still going on? Like, yeah, I remember hearing about it when it happened last year, and I just haven't heard that much. And when I mention I have a podcast, I'll get a response of like, oh, that's great. I really want to learn more about it. I just didn't know where to go to look. And so I think it has somewhat fallen off of the news cycle and the consciousness, and that when information does come, it has to come in the form of some kind of political breakthrough, or the opposite of a political breakthrough, some collapse or some atrocity that happened, or some kind of dense story out of the UN, or involving political intrigue that is more high level. But I think this breaks through some of those big stories by giving us an on the ground view, which is exactly what's needed. And I hope that works like this can reach beyond those that are simply connected to Myanmar and care about Myanmar, but those that honor this cry from the human heart, and those that are joining in this shared humanity and are just able to understand what beyond history taking place and these big headlines, the feeling of loss, just this tremendous feeling of injustice and loss for no reason, of losing someone in your life, or losing some freedom, or losing some possibility or hope for oneself or one's community or the greater country, and how that comes alive is just, it is so tragic and so devastating and so real. And this is an ongoing story that is continuing to unfold. And I think that as you mentioned, as stories like Ukraine and other places are taking more of the world's attention, and this is, even before Ukraine, this wasn't really rising past the point of consciousness for many people to stay on, that the most we can do are works like this that are able to speak to that, or art shows or podcast conversations, or hip hop songs, or whatever else is able to give that expression that this is still ongoing, and this is a part of the shared humanity that wherever we are and whoever we are, that we can understand these kind of universal archetypes that these stories come through with.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the media is essentially a double-edged sword. Obviously, on the one hand, it can draw attention to these conflicts, to these situations, and really magnify them, and serve as a catalyst for people to try and contribute in one way or another to some sort of amelioration or resolution to these conflicts. But on the other hand, you have a media that's driven by headlines, by things like parachute journalism, by sensationalism. And as you mentioned, if it's not something that would be attention grabbing or headline grabbing, then it often tends to not make it into the news cycle. And sadly, these things are cycles. It is cyclical, but the conflict isn't. The conflict is very much an ongoing thing, and so many people are largely unaware of these conflicts throughout the world, not only in Myanmar, but throughout the world, internationally, globally, because the media functions in such a way that it doesn't really sustain its coverage of these events, but rather chooses to focus on, in the case of Myanmar, the beginning of it, which was obviously shocking and it had that kind of sensationalist quality to it, but then the coverage dies out, or it shifts to other parts of the world or other subjects and things like that. Another point that you mentioned too is this idea of intergenerational violence and trauma. I mean, not only are these people in Myanmar, all of these people from various ethnicities and religions and backgrounds and classes and professions and so on experiencing this violence, but this is something. I think this kind of violence is being passed down intergenerationally throughout Myanmar and throughout Burmese society, and really throughout so much of the country and its people. And really, that's something that I sort of wonder about, the effects of that. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we had these contributions from earlier periods, 2020 to 2010, and then from 2010 to 1988, to underscore the extent to which this is a sort of intergenerational problem, and that it has obviously impacted previous generations. It's impacting the current generation, and this kind of violence is going to continue to impact Myanmar in the future, even if that violence ceases in the immediate future, which sadly it doesn't seem like it will. That this is something very much sort of interwoven into Myanmar society and its history, sort of interwoven into the fabric of I suppose, Myanmar's stories. And I really wonder about the consequences and the impacts of that kind of intergenerational trauma and violence.
Certainly, and this is something that we've seen with Generation Z is trying so hard to make a final resistance of this and to make a new shift and a new way forward for Myanmar society, but it's certainly no easy way. I'm also reflecting on, you said now that you see when you're looking at the cyclical nature of the way that that news gets reported, and that's in contrast to these big headlines. There's another contrast that came to my mind when hearing that, and it's rather than looking at something one time or cyclical, something that came to mind when I was reading your anthology was the contrast between something being temporary and permanent, and the example of a big headline when it comes out of something, some great loss of life, like what happened in Bago or in Lingtei last year. This is almost these big headlines are temporary in their own way. They're impermanent because they're just passing. They arise and they pass away. Another Buddhist concept here, and then we move on to the next thing. But what came about in your book was this sense of permanence, this sense of a permanent loss, that is going to stain one forever, for the rest of their life and for their community's life. And when in the loss that is described in your pages by the firsthand accounts of people who are expressing what they've gone through, it's this, the loss is so devastating very much because it's written in very permanent kind of ways, in a subjective way, from the speaker, from the writer expressing oneself. They are giving life to this sense that something has been irrevocably lost forever. And that's not true of everything. I mean, obviously there people can get over some things. There can be difficult periods that one has to pass through and then eventually find a new way forward. But there are other, obviously a loss of life is as permanent as it gets. And that's not just the end of that person's life. It's also everyone that person was connected with. It's also something that is never coming back. It's a relationship or a force in the world that is gone forever. And so it's another interesting thing to contrast this. We have the cyclical nature, as you talked about, things that keep coming back and that keep having to be dealt with and aren't just these big headlines. But then there's also this heavy sense of permanence that I think the headlines don't give justice to, that some terrible incident or atrocity that happens. Yes, that's terrible for us to have to learn about and know from a distant corner of the world, and having learned about it and seen this really bad incident that happened. But beyond that reporting, the stories that are expressed in this anthology go into this permanent sense of loss that one has to somehow, with this burden, find a way forevermore to get through, having this terrible, terrible thing that they're having to hold on to and having to find some way to let go of. And I think that's another kind of universality in reading this that one is struck with. And I think that's also why it impacted me so much, even through all the familiarity I have following this, living this out for the past year and a half. It was just this burden, this overwhelming sense of finality, of loss that really comes through strongly by some of the selections that you choose.
Yeah, absolutely. And the extent to which this loss is inscribed into a person's life. And that loss becomes part of that person's, that history, or the community's history, or family's history, or, region's history, or country's history. And I think one of the ways that, I suppose it might be a sort of a traditionalist view, but I think one of the things that we also wanted to do is we didn't want to put out simply an ebook. We wanted the permanence of a physical book that could be, stored on shelves and that had that kind of permanency in a library or on a bookshelf or something like that. Obviously, books can be destroyed, lost. The papers can they yellow and wither away, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, there is the kind of permanency to a physical book that a digital book or an ebook doesn't have, and we really wanted to have that sense of permanency through the physical object of this book itself, and to be able to really to share that book, to be able to have that book circulate, just as these stories and ideas circulate, to be able to have the physical book itself circulate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny hearing you say that, because when we first got in touch, you sent me an e-copy of the book, which I actually didn't read because there was something in me that I wanted the physical book. I just felt like I've been living digitally, remotely for so long in understanding and seeing this conflict developed. And this is a book that's printed. There's a physical book. So I want to wait until I can get a physical copy, sit down and read it. And I think it did have an impact on me. And having seeing these stories in physical print that I had been living through remotely in the past year, and seeing this sense of reality and of verification, validifying that this really did happen, somehow holding that in my hand gave a different experience than the online digital version. And so I think that, combined with the permanent loss and burden as expressed in these stories, which you rightly also indicate, this is a sense of their identity going forward. This one terrible moment that happened, and Burmese people in this past year and a half, so many people in the country have had so many terrible moments, random moments of violence, a bullet just passing through the home of someone, of a child just sitting there doing nothing. That this permanent sense of loss is captured and shared in this anthology. So yes, that really comes through.
Yeah, and for all of the for all of the suffering, for all of the loss, for all of the trauma, for all of the death, for all of the torture and things like that, there nevertheless, there is a spirit of optimism. I mean, the title itself, "Picking Off New Shoots Will Not Stop the Spring," despite all of these things, there are these paths forward. People continue to resist. People continue to fight. People continue to write. And there is this kind of indomitable spring that just doesn't seem to be able to be suppressed or repressed.
Yeah. Let's hope so. Before I let you go, just you looking at the book itself. Of course, the title once again is "Picking Off New Shoots Will Not Stop the Spring." You also have a cover art on the book. Can you explain the meaning of that?
Yeah, the image itself is by an artist who prefers to remain anonymous, and the image is quite striking. It's in the shape of Myanmar. So for those of readers or listeners who are unfamiliar with Myanmar, its history, culture, or simply unfamiliar with its shape on a map, its geography, its physical shape, it's shaped in the shape of Myanmar itself, and it has this blood spattering. It has the sort of this visceral red and orange, obviously to allude to the kind of violence that's continues to happen there. But also it has the symbolism of resistance, these flip-flops that seem to recur throughout these various resistance movements within Myanmar's history. And so we have some work that alludes to this metaphor, really, but also again to these physical objects, to these flip-flops. And in one of the works, it refers to the flip-flops that were left behind because the military had opened fire on a crowd, and the crowd obviously had to disperse, running for their lives, and often these flip-flops were left behind as people were seeking shelter from the junta's bullets.
Right, that's a really striking image. And yeah, I encourage all listeners to find a copy of this book. It's really quite extraordinary. And I thank you, Brian, for taking the time to join and explain about the process of creating this over the course of the past year.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
We'd like to take this time to thank our generous supporters who have already given. we simply cannot continue to provide you with this content and information without the wonderful support of generous listeners, donors, and friends like you. Each episode helps in providing access to one more voice, one more perspective, one more insight. Every donation of any size is greatly appreciated, and it helps us to continue this mission. We greatly appreciate your generosity, which allows us to maintain this platform and everything else we do. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's BETTERBURMA.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Ko Napuvo Dentayare. The song Lepwet Kulu, Ye Ine Winom Suyendao. Sidako, Yinde, Amiatania Ma, Dentabi Ma Yare. Sidaha, Ni Imbo, Pascavo, Saigebo, Niama Yui, Akaga, a Sitsi Kanyare. Quelunduri Ma, a Temashiro we met. Sidaka. Dulu sweating it on me. Being a shook can a camaro. Say that ha, Yeji Bulu, Hong Tatlara, Niame. The Daingo, own it, quack can a camale. Jong Yellow, say that ha, Topa, Dinjan Nigere. Say that yet Kandaha, say that be. Say that yet Teshudanha, say that be. Say that yet Lanha. Say that Babe. Mowe the spirit. I sleep with the spirit on my forehead. Like a talisman, I will leave it at a high place before I visit the loo. The spirit gets stopped and frisked in the house, on the bus, and on the motorcycle. It gets stopped and frisked anywhere, anytime. Fallen heroes may be lifeless. They are not spiritless. Their spirit is tattooed on our skin. When burned alive, the spirit sizzles and pops like the flesh. Like gemstones, The spirit outshines the barricade bomb blasts. The spirit body is the spirit. The spirit breath is the spirit. The spirit flag is the spirit.
Yeah.